on digital diplomacy in Africa, a series of the authors from a special issue on that subject. And I will be introducing them shortly, but first just wanted to welcome people. We understand we have over 200 people signing up today, and so we'll be giving them an opportunity to log on before we get started underway. There will be an opportunity for questions, and I would encourage you to use the Q&A function to type in your question when it occurs to you during the panelists' presentation. And there's also a chat function to enable people to seek assistance if you need any technical assistance, etc. We will be mostly looking at questions in the Q&A box, I will just note. We do have some PowerPoints, so while I am, well, let me first start by introducing the speakers, all four of them, before we begin to upload PowerPoints. Today we have with us Dr. Ilan Manor, who is based at the University of Tel Aviv. Just a moment, I just want to pull something up that the paper that he has written is looking at diaspora diplomacy, two different African states. Specifically, it's entitled From Traitors to Saviors, a longitudinal analysis of Ethiopian, Kenyan, and Rwandan embassies, so 3 states, practice of digital diaspora diplomacy. And Ilan Manor is a digital diplomacy scholar there at the University of Tel Aviv. His 2019 book entitled The Digitalization of Public Diplomacy was followed by a 2021 co-edited volume examining public diplomacy and the politics of uncertainty. He is also a founding member of the Oxford Digital Diplomacy Research Group and is affiliated with the University of Southern California Center on Public Diplomacy. So welcome, Dr. Manor. He, just to mention, his co-author on this paper for the special issue is Geraldine Asawome Adiku, who is a lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of Ghana. So Dr. Manor will be representing her as well while he presents the findings of his paper. Next up will be Jarek Turianansky and Bob Wakisa. Bob is the Axus Partnership Research and Communications Manager, but really he's the director of the center, I would say. He runs an amazing amount of projects out of Axus. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Nairobi and master's and doctoral degrees from the Communication University of China. His background is in journalism. His area of research is the intersection of media and communications on the one hand, and geopolitics, diplomacy, and foreign policy on the other. And he focuses quite specifically on public diplomacy. So welcome to you, Bob. The other author on that paper, and I'll just read the title of Bob and Jarek's paper, which arises from a series of seminars that they held, which we will be hearing about, I'm sure, with diplomats in Africa. And the title is African Digital Diplomacy, Emergence, Evolution, and the Future. Jarek is the Deputy Program Head for the African Governance and Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. He joined the Institute in 2008 after completing his master's degree in political science from the University of Pretoria. And in that master's, he assessed the African peer review mechanism as a standard for good governance on the continent. He has authored numerous reports and opinion pieces for SAJIA on various governance themes and is the co-author of a book entitled African Accountability, What Works and What Doesn't. And I just have to also mention that Jarek has been involved at various South African radio stations as both a presenter and correspondent. So he is definitely also in the world of media. Finally, Odilile Ayodele will join us today. I should mention, Yerek, Bob, and Odilile have been the guest editors as a team of the special issue that we are going to be discussing. And she is a senior research associate with the BRICS project in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. She holds a PhD in politics, also from UJ, and her research explores the politics of digitalization in Africa. She has published elsewhere in SAJIA on the digital divide in Africa. So you might look out for her paper on that as well. I think that covers it for my introductory remarks. And I could just mention that I was thrilled when I received this proposal for a special issue from Bob and Yerek, and then we pulled Odie in based on her research interests, and it's been a great team. I am aware that the subject can go in many different directions, and so I thought I would just mention from the introductory paper that the three have authored that the term digital diplomacy, which entered in the lexicon in the last 2 decades, refers to the intersection of information and communication technologies with the functions of diplomacy. And this special issue has been developed around the concept and practice of digital diplomacy from an African perspective. So that, I believe, is one of its main contributions to the discourse. And with that, I will turn over, I believe, we begin the program with Ilan Manor, if he would like to share his screen so that his slideshow is visible. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you're able to see my PowerPoint presentation at this point. Yes, okay. Well, my name is Dr. Ilan Manor, and I'm a member of the Department of Communications at the University of Tel Aviv and a member of Oxford University's Digital Diplomacy Research Group. And I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak, and especially thanking the editors for inviting me to contribute to this very important special issue. And I'll begin by comments by discussing briefly the digitalization of diplomacy, and then focus in specifically on the research that me and Geraldine Adiku conducted for the special issue. And I'd like to actually begin with terminology, which is something that was just raised, and try to answer the question, what is digital diplomacy? And when it was first employed in 2015, digital diplomacy was broadly defined as the use of digital technologies to obtain foreign policy goals. And this, of course, is a very broad definition that refers to any kind of technology, from social media pages to Wikipedia to launching embassies in virtual worlds. But I personally believe that the term digital diplomacy is somewhat lacking for several reasons. First, it suggests that digital diplomacy is a type of diplomatic practice. Just as diplomats practice consular diplomacy and bilateral diplomacy, they also practice digital diplomacy. But we know that digital technologies have now permeated into every department in foreign ministries. Second, the term seems to create a dichotomy, saying that some foreign ministries are digital while others are non-digital. But we now know that about 90% of UN member states have established some form of digital presence. And lastly, the term digital diplomacy has become synonymous with social media, and especially the social media activities of foreign ministries in Western Europe and North America. But digital diplomacy is in no way a Western phenomenon. I mean, African foreign ministries have been offering consular aid online from 2013. For instance, Kenya evacuated its citizens from South Sudan in 2013 using Twitter, years ahead of other foreign ministries. Asian countries now use social media to promote their culture. The Indian foreign ministry has launched the world's most sophisticated smartphone application, which you can see on the screen, that can be used by global citizens, Indian citizens, and Indian diasporas. And even Arab states such as Saudi Arabia now legitimize their foreign interventions online. So I think that we might need a new term to conceptualize this practice, and I'd like to suggest the term the digitalization of diplomacy. And by digitalization, I'm referring to a long-term process in which digital technologies reshape the norms, values, and working routines of foreign ministries. And importantly, I'd like to argue that every foreign ministry is now on its own process of digitalization that can be impacted by a myriad of factors ranging from geography to national interests and needs. And the truth is that we now have almost 20 years of experience in the digital realm of diplomacy, and we can almost have a timeline of important events. And most scholars would argue that digitalization began when Sweden launched its virtual embassy to Second Life in 2008. And this was an idea to create a virtual embassy that could be accessed by any computer user around the world. And so it was really the world's first global embassy, focusing specifically on cultural events, enabling users to meet Swedish artists or to visit art exhibits. In 2011, America launched its virtual embassy to Iran, and here the idea was to overcome lack of bilateral ties. There are no American diplomats in Iran, so the State Department thought through a website we could interact with Iranian citizens and narrate our policies across the region. The Arab Spring, of course, brought about a major shift in digitalization, and already in 2012, the State Department was managing a social media empire of more than 1,000 accounts. Today, it's closer to 3,000. But this, again, is not unique to America or the State Department. This is the social media empire of the Qatari government. And we now see across government that most foreign ministries have established some digital presence. 2015 was an interesting year because it demonstrated that diplomats had become acquainted with the language of digital technologies. And in 2015, Germany actually announced the expulsion of Russia from the G8 in a tweet. And this is the tweet that was published at the height of the Crimean crisis. And as you can see, it begins with the hashtag G7, call on Russia to de-escalate conflict in Crimea and other parts of Ukraine. The referendum, Crimean referendum, would have no legal effect. Now, there was no press briefing and there was no meeting with journalists. There was simply this tweet with the hashtag G7, but immediately journalists throughout the world began to report that Russia had been expelled from the G8. And by 2016, foreign ministries such as Canada, Poland, and Norway all started launching smartphone applications. This is the Canadian application, which is a travel warning mechanism. Any Canadian who lands anywhere in the world can turn it on and see if there's any travel guidance to where he's visiting. Now, all this was true until 2015, but between 2015 and 2020, the digitalization of diplomacy altered dramatically. And this is because the technologies adopted by foreign ministries began to differ. And the emphasis was no longer so much on using digital technologies to engage or talk with citizens around the world, but adopting tools to identify, track, and disable fake social media accounts and fake news sites. So this, of course, was a response to the rise of digital propaganda. And some believe that digitalization has advanced in an almost linear fashion. So first we had virtual embassies, then diplomats adopted social media, then they learned the language of social media. But the truth is that offline events have always shaped the trajectory of diplomacy's digitalization. So as we saw in 2008, we began with virtual diplomacy, but following the Arab Spring, we began talking about digital diplomacy, because following the Arab Spring, diplomats sought to use social media to interact with foreign populations and, even more importantly, monitor online conversations, perhaps anticipating future crises or future shocks to the international system. Russian digital interventions in Brexit and the US election led to diplomatic digital interventions. For instance, diplomats using big data analysis to track and identify disinformation campaigns. It will be interesting to see how COVID-19 impacts digitalization. So as I said, digitalization is impacted by external events. Israel, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, now has a code writing unit. There are people sitting in Tel Aviv writing algorithms that might help stem the flow of hate speech online. The UK Foreign Office has created a big data unit following Brexit, which is really tasked with identifying and neutralizing fake social media accounts, while the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry has established monitoring groups who actually use digital platforms to identify and counter Russian disinformation campaigns. Now, an interesting question that we need to ask is, why do foreign ministries migrate online or adopt digital technologies in the first place? And as I said, every foreign ministry is on its own course of digitalization, and digitalization can be impacted by a myriad of factors, ranging from whole of government approaches to digital technologies to geographic locations. So for instance, the US State Department first migrated online given a desire to interact with Muslim internet users following the war on terror, and because of a directive by the Obama administration urging all government ministries to leverage digital technologies to interact with stakeholders. New Zealand decided to adopt digital technologies following the examples of its allies, the UK and the US. Norway and Finland began using social media to manage ties with local and global media outlets, while Lithuania has eagerly adopted digital technologies over the past 3 years in order to counter Russian disinformation. For Poland, digitalization has been closely linked with image management and distancing Poland from the atrocities of World War II, while in India, we see a focus on using digital tools to strengthen ties with distant diasporas. And the truth is that scholars have tended to treat foreign ministries as islands entire of themselves. But it's also important to bear in mind that events and technologies that impact society as a whole impact diplomats, giving rise to new norms and working routines. So to understand contemporary diplomacy is also to understand contemporary society. For instance, when social media sites were viewed by society as a positive force and the harbingers of the Arab Spring, diplomats viewed them as tools for relationship building, and they launched virtual embassies on Facebook and Twitter. But when social media were viewed as negative forces in society that create echo chambers of disinformation, diplomats viewed these tools as tools for foreign meddling, and they wrote algorithms to track and disable fake accounts. Now, zooming in on this special issue and asking why have African foreign ministries migrated online or adopted digital technologies? For instance, why has Kenya crafted a digital diplomacy policy? Why has Ethiopia created social media accounts? Why do Rwanda and Uganda have digital departments in their foreign ministry? What is the motivation behind Ghana's migration online or South Africa's extensive use of Facebook? The truth is that we do not know. We don't have answers to these questions. And most studies focusing on digital diplomacy focus on Western Europe, North America, or Russia. We have recently seen a spike in studies about China because Chinese ambassadors are increasingly using social media, and there's even growing interest in digital diplomacy in India and Pakistan. But if you review the digital diplomacy research corpus, only 2% of digital diplomacy studies focus on countries in Africa, despite the fact that African foreign ministries are digital innovators in the case of Kenya, early adopters of digital technologies in the case of South Africa, and have outlined clear digital diplomacy strategies, such as in the case of Uganda. And I think this is why this special issue is so important, and it really promotes 3 important goals. First, to begin to accumulate knowledge on the digital diplomacy, digitalization of diplomacy in African countries. Second, to draw scholars' attention to the need to investigate digitalization in African countries. And of course, an important opportunity to look at the diversity of digital approaches. Within the continent, we have 54 countries, so 54 stories to tell, 54 examples of digitalization, 54 examples of interactions between societies and diplomats. Not to mention Africa's importance in the 21st century, and there's a reason why Africa is at the core of global competitions over hegemony. Now a little bit about our contribution to this special issue that was co-authored by myself and Dr. Geraldine Duko. And we wanted to look at the diaspora diplomacy of Ethiopian, Kenyan, and Rwandan embassy, and really focus on the idea of digitalization and diaspora ties. Now, it should be mentioned that the digital age reconfigures the experience of diasporas to a certain extent. Through social media groups, diasporas can maintain an emotional bond with their origin countries. Through WhatsApp groups, they can remain active participants of their former societies. At the same time, diaspora members are boundary expanders in their host countries. They can help shape national image. So the South African diaspora in the UK can shape how Brits understand South Africa and South African policy, not to mention that digitalization expands the national borders so that these come to include diasporas within the national imaginary. Now, our study looked at 3 countries that had 4 things in common. First, they had a globally dispersed diaspora. Second, they had all devised digital diaspora policies. Third, their MFAs, foreign ministries, had embraced digital technologies. And 4, they were all heavily reliant on remittances from diaspora. So when we look at countries like Kenya and Rwanda, a significant proportion of their GDP is generated by remittances from diasporas. And we decided to take a longitudinal analysis, looking at the Facebook activities of 9 embassies, 3 from Rwanda, 3 from Kenya, 3 from Ethiopia, in 2016 and in 2020. And we wanted to do a longitudinal analysis because, as I said, digitalization is a long-term process and it takes foreign ministries and diplomats time to leverage digital technologies. And we really wanted to look at three core activities. The first we defined as online relationship building. So using Facebook to foster an online community with diasporas, interacting with diasporas in conversations, informing diasporas on events happening in origin countries, and enabling diasporas to maintain an emotional bond with their origin country, which is so central to the diasporic experience. Second, to look at offline community building. For instance, using Facebook to generate participation in offline diaspora events. And finally, relationship leveraging. And here we try to argue that it's the combination of online and offline activities that can help countries galvanize diasporas to enhance bilateral ties, to strengthen economic ties, and to increase investments in origin countries. And we also wanted to look what was the approach taken by these foreign ministries to digitalization and diasporas. And using Gamelan's topology, we were interested in our embassies taking a tapping approach, which basically focuses on raising financial aid, increasing remittances from diasporas, and convincing diasporas to invest in their origin country. Or do these embassies take an embracing approach, using digital tools to extend the national borders to help diasporas maintain the emotional bond with their origin country? In other words, we ask, when these embassies go on Facebook, is it all about the money? Another interesting dichotomy that we wanted to look at was the view of diasporas as traitors versus saviors. I know that this has been true in certain African countries. It's also been true in other countries, such as Israel. Until the late 1980s, Israel viewed diasporas as traitors who had abandoned the nation following independence. From 1980s and onwards, Israel and other countries look at diasporas as saviors that can contribute to the financial prosperity of their origin country. And we asked, do these changing perspectives impact the use of digital technologies in diaspora diplomacy? Like I said, once again, is it all about the money, or is it about creating ties and relationships? So we did the two analyses. The first one was in 2016, and we looked at the Facebook activities of 9 embassies. And in all of them, we saw a tapping approach. Social media was used to share information about financial projects in the origin country. For instance, national infrastructure projects, and raising awareness of diasporas to platforms for sending remittances. There were even direct calls on diasporas to offer financial aid. So certain Ethiopian diplomats around the world told the diaspora that it was their responsibility to send remittances back home and help the country reach greater economic prosperity. We found no online publication of offline diaspora events, and we found little attempts to maintain an emotional bond. Now, you might be asking, how can an embassy help a diaspora maintain an emotional bond? Well, one way is digitally celebrating national holidays. Another way is digitally celebrating national achievements, whether it's financial prosperity or winning medals in Olympic Games. Most importantly, we looked at 9 embassies in different countries across a 4-month period, and we did not find a single instance of interaction between African diplomats and diasporas. So mostly these embassies used Facebook as a one-way communication medium. Then we returned to these embassies in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And first, most evidently, we found much higher rates of interactions online, and we saw a shift from tapping to embracing. For instance, embassies sharing and celebrating national achievements online with diasporas. Embassies informing diasporas about important news from origin country and offering commentary on events happening in the origin country, celebrating national holidays together online, and even online organization of offline events. We also found many instances of direct interactions between African diplomats and diasporas, whether it was related to consular affairs, answering questions, or even responding to criticism of certain African countries and their current policies. So what we really see here is that 2016 to 2020 was an important era in the digitalization of diplomacy in the Kenyan, Rwandan, and Ethiopian foreign ministry. And like I said, digitalization is a long-term process. Leveraging digital technologies does not occur overnight. Both foreign ministries and diplomats need to learn how to leverage digital tools, and this usually takes place through digital initiatives, digital failures, because diplomats learn a lot from their failures, crises that force diplomats to adopt new technologies, and a process of trial and error. And just as an example, in 2016, I asked a very high-ranking Swiss diplomat if he ever engages with his followers on Twitter. And his answer was never, because I don't want to feed the trolls. That was his perspective in 2016. Last month, I asked him the same question. Do you now interact with your followers on Twitter? And his response was, of course, because I want to engage with global publics. So the digitalization of diplomacy advances at different paces in different foreign ministries, whether it's in Africa or whether it's elsewhere. So what are the main conclusions? I think this special issue demonstrates the relevance of a new research agenda examining digitalization of diplomacy in Africa, whether it's digitalization and cultural promotion, whether it's digitalization and diaspora ties, or maybe it's digitalization and multilateral negotiations. Like I said, we have 54 case studies and 54 examples of the process of unique digitalization. So thank you very much for inviting me today. Those are my comments, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilan. That was a very broad overview, and you did well to stay within your allotted time. So thank you. I should have mentioned that I'll be coming online if time is drawing nigh, and it seems that the speakers are not yet nearing the end of their presentation, so that we can fit everybody in. Okay, on that note, we can move to Bob and Yerrick, if you'd like to share your screen with the PowerPoint presentation on your paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think Yerrick and I will pick up from where Dr. Ilan Mana has left, discussing, in fact, in a more general, but in a sense focused manner all at once, the title of our paper, African Digital Diplomacy, Emergence, Evolution, and the Future. And I think this paper was, in fact, inspired broadly by the goals of the special issue, which was that we wanted to contribute thoughts, ideas, and perspectives. In fact, theoretical frameworks on African digital diplomacy as a means of redressing the yawning gap in research and knowledge production on this very important dynamic from an African perspective. But to do so, we had to actually go back to what diplomacy is. And the obvious realization, which was an obvious thing, was that historically diplomacy has always relied on proximity, at least from its formative and ferment years. But things have changed over time, and I think this is what Dr. Ilan Mana was alluding to, with the rise in every manner of technologies, so that at every stage when we have the development of technologies such as the telegraph or the telephone or film or radio and so forth, these have actually impacted and somehow changed the nature of diplomacy, which, as we know, is about communication, negotiation, and representation. So it has had an impact. These technologies have had an impact across the board. However, I think we see a rapid change, fast-paced change from the beginning of the 21st century, and this we discuss in our paper, with the rise in information and communication technologies, particularly the internet and social media, which actually disrupted and revolutionized diplomatic practices around the world. And so from an African perspective, we're asking ourselves, how has it happened on the continent? Is it any unique? And to do that, of course, we went back to the definition of digital diplomacy itself as a guide or a searchlight or a lighthouse. And we used a very conventional one. I know Ilan has talked of digitalization of diplomacy, but we rather used Marcus Holmes' 2019 definition, which is that digital diplomacy is the use of digital information communication technologies such as the internet to achieve diplomatic objectives. And we also did realize in our reviews of literature that in academia, the study of digital diplomacy is considered interdisciplinary, so that it draws heavily from the communications end of things, which might include media and journalism and so forth, but also from the broad international relations field where diplomacy, foreign policy, statecraft, and related fields sit. But at the same time, it also draws on the IT world, the information technology field, which is the technical field. And for that reason, there are very few ways in which you can look at digital diplomacy without really looking at the intersection of various diplomacies, various disciplines within its confines. But at the same time, the digital diplomacy itself remains a subfield, even as it touches other fields, particularly as some diplomatic practices continue to operate in a digital format. I think it has been mentioned that digital diplomacy is not going to essentially obliterate face-to-face diplomacy completely, even after COVID-19. Nonetheless, there is a recognition that digital diplomacy or diplomacy in the digital age varies greatly from the kind of diplomacy that we have seen manifest in the past. And I think a very good guide here has been the COVID-19 period, when summits had to happen virtually. I think we can move. So digital diplomacy is also often referred to by other names, and I think these are names that sometimes conflate the field. And these include e-diplomacy, so that diplomacy is also considered along the same lines as e-governance, or just diplomacy. In fact, as Dr. Ilan Mann was mentioning, that actually we cannot talk of digital diplomacy anymore. There's just diplomacy because it happens in digital format. Diplomacy, which derives from Twitter, the combination of Twitter and diplomacy. Network diplomacy, because we see messages relating to countries jumping from one social media platform like, say, Facebook to Twitter to WhatsApp through the affordances or the capabilities that these technologies allow. Word terms such as mobile diplomacy deriving from mobile telephony, virtual diplomacy, digital public diplomacy, and indeed the use of the terms like cyber diplomacy to say this is really diplomacy in the cloud in some sense. And I think here we quote again Dr. Ilan Mann, and I do not need to expend too much energy on what he has said, that it is really the digitalization of diplomacy that we are talking about here. For the time being, however, the terminologies are fractured, and I think the onus is on us scholars to come in, and actually practitioners to come into this and find out what definition means what. And I think this is work cut out for us. Next slide. I think a brief history of digital diplomacy, it goes back many years, but I think the delineation of the first instance in which we see the talk of, in a manner that brings it closer to digital diplomacy is in the 1984 book by the now moribund United States Information Agency entitled Public Diplomacy in the Computer Age. In fact, recognition that computers were here and they were interfacing with diplomacy. In 1992, there were green activists at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro over these carbon emissions and how they're depleting the ozone layer. And this was the first instance in which activists used email, in fact, to do advocacy work. In 1994, we saw an exchange between then President Bill Clinton and Swiss President Prime Minister, in fact, Carl Bildt, talking about economic relations. And this was considered one of the first times in which presidents were exchanging emails. In the 2000s, there was quite a rapid rise. In fact, this is when the digital diplomacy started taking shape with the launch of internet applications such as Wikipedia in 2001, LinkedIn in 2003, YouTube in 2005, Facebook in 2006, Twitter in 2006, WhatsApp in 2009, Instagram 2010, TikTok 2016. And these have actually been appropriated by diplomacy pretty fast. In the early 2000s, we also saw African countries start setting up e-government portals and websites and so forth. And I think those of us who are older enough will remember the very exciting times of ministries actually having websites as a means of communication. So as early as 2003, challenges brought about by ICTs had become evident, in fact. There was the changing architecture of power because of moving from analog to digital formats. There was real-time news reporting and less time to process or respond to issues that diplomats also grappled with. There's the proliferation of information sources and channels. I think we did just touch on the many applications that have now compete for our attention, every day. There was a crowded soft power arena. There was the rise of China, for example. Israel was coming in with its own communication. Countries such as South Korea were rising in terms of digital communication and so forth, and therefore all competing for soft power on the African continent. There are challenges to military and defense strategies, particularly with the rise of the global war on terror, with groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS also actually actively using these platforms to do their warfare. ICTs therefore threaten diplomats, central position in the conduct of foreign affairs. In fact, it was in fact mentioned that diplomacy, as we knew it, had come to an end in quotes. Government agencies, typically conservative in their approach, had to actually start catching up, and it was not an activity or a change that many of the governments were really government officials were embraced pretty fast, but they had to adopt. And therefore, there's need for new skills because diplomats as civil servants couldn't just neglect the heavy criticism they were receiving or engagement of one form or another and so forth. They had to engage in storytelling as a function of digital diplomacy, for example. Okay, we can move on. I think this in this slide it goes just to demonstrate to illustrate what Dr. Mano was saying earlier, that over the 75 academic journal papers that Yarik and I collected and analyzed, most of them were of unpublished masters and doctoral dissertations. There were very few peer-reviewed journal articles. 70% of these were actually papers based on, for example, the global North, Middle East, and Asia, digital diplomacy in Africa. For example, Chinese or American digital diplomacy in Africa, rather than African digital diplomacy out there, or intra-Africa for that matter. 30% had mention of digital diplomacy in Africa, but that was just a mention. And therefore, in fact, this encouraged us to actually go for this special issue as a contribution. So the long and short of it is that digital diplomacy in Africa is greatly understudied, and its practice is also inadvertent, is not intentional. It has come about through some kind of trial and error and some kind of catching up. Indeed, this paper drew on a series of seminars that we undertook with the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, which is the South African MFA, in partnership with the SAJIA and the University of Southern California Center on Public Diplomacy, to actually, in fact, initiate what was then considered last year the first ever seminar on digital diplomacy. Right? Next slide. And I think here I'll turn over to Yarik to take us through the next slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. Appreciate it. And just to say that it was an absolute pleasure to work with you on this article. So I'm very glad that it's now seen the light of day and that you and I have an opportunity to present it. So one of the key themes that came out in the webinar that Bob just mentioned was the fact that in some of the pioneering countries of digital diplomacy, such as the United States, they also weren't really speaking about digital diplomacy because it was just an extension of diplomacy as young diplomats were becoming more senior. They've already grown up with social media so they were digital natives. And for them, it was very natural to venture out into the digital world, to communicate, to collaborate, and essentially it just became a part of what they did for their jobs, for the diplomatic practice. But obviously, if we look at North America, US, it's got very high internet penetration rates, over 90%, as you can see from this slide. And this is closely followed by the European continent, for instance, then Latin America, Middle East, Australia, Oceania. But unfortunately, as we can see from this slide, the only continent where less than half of the population is connected to the internet is the African continent. So it's 42.2%. Obviously these are approximate figures. There are different sources, and some of these sources do not necessarily agree with each other, but this is in the ballpark, and this is the information that Bob and I decided to use for this paper. So significantly below the global averages, unfortunately, and lagging behind the continent. It is growing. It is growing at much faster pace than some of the other continents, but it's also because it started from a very low base when the internet was coming about in the early 2000s. So obviously, without the internet these days, one cannot communicate, post, or share anything, participate in digital diplomacy, or even participate and attend in this webinar. You need a good, stable broadband connection to be able to listen in and view the proceedings and see what we are talking about. So unfortunately, this is something that is putting many people in Africa, especially the young people, at a disadvantage because they are not becoming digital natives like some of their counterparts in the global north. You need ICT infrastructure for digital diplomacy. You need electricity, you need intranet, you need a computer. So that's where the socioeconomic digital divide also comes in. And at a basic level, many African countries are even affected by lack of electrification and frequent outages. I remember that a few years ago, for South Africa and for the South African government, the fourth industrial revolution was a key trend that they were trying to follow, and you would see it on their social media accounts. You would hear it in speeches. They also, this was in the pre-COVID days, but they still tried to have webinars about it, and I think quite a few of these webinars were cancelled or postponed because of load shedding in South Africa. So when you have no electricity, unfortunately, anything more advanced is becoming difficult, such as fiber optic, 5G technologies, data service centers. You need to get the basics right, and then you can proceed with more advanced technologies. So generally, the lack of connectivity in many African countries and societies poses a serious threat to digital diplomacy because people and young diplomats are growing up without that digital literacy and digital skills. So they're not as comfortable as people who are connected 24/7 and 365. I've included this slide. Please ignore the statement. This is just for visual purposes. This is for another project that I work on at SAJIA on nuclear energy. But I'm sure you've seen this before in magazines, on the intranet. This is a picture of the world from space, of the globe, and you can see that Europe, North America during the night are very lit. They're electrified. They're bright lights. On the other hand, in Africa, unfortunately, we see South Africa being lit. We see some parts of North Africa being lit, some parts of West Africa, but unfortunately, in the middle, there is hardly any electrification. And for the risk of repeating myself, without electricity, you cannot have intranet. without internet, you cannot have a digital diplomacy. Now, Bob's mentioned some of the deficits, and I think this is also something that came through in Dr. Manner's earlier keynote address. But we do see the potential growth points on the continent, and there are indeed examples of digital presence in Africa, which includes operation of Facebook and Twitter account by most African ministries of foreign affairs, Ethiopia's use of social media for diaspora diplomacy, which Dr. Manner just spoke about, former Kenyan foreign minister, for instance, serving as a hub to connect and network other ministers, and also in Kenya, the use of Twitter by official following former US President Barack Obama's visit in 2015 as a very effective image branding strategy and opportunity. And of course, sometimes you are forced to do what you are maybe reluctant to do, or what you thought you'll be able to do at a later stage. But COVID-19 last year did force the rapid digitalization on the African continent. The webinars that Bob was referring to, I met Bob in I think November 2019, and we started planning these webinars for July last year, and it was supposed to be an entire week of activities at the University of Wits, including some of the other universities, including numerous events from training and lectures to meetings between academics and practitioners, cocktails, dinners, all sorts of things. And we had to do everything online at the end of the day. Also during July and August last year, I think it was over 20 webinars that ultimately took place. You obviously can have a week of activities, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. So it was over 20 webinars of about 2 hours each, very similar in format to this one. And we weren't the only ones who were rapidly digitalizing. African governments were doing the same thing. So South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was also the African Union chair last year, undertook most of his continental diplomacy almost entirely online, including meetings with other heads of states and chairing of AU meetings. Nigeria's Commission for Diaspora Affairs, for instance, provided online advice on evacuation from China and some of the other places when the outbreak was happening in March last year. Also organized online meetings to support people who were still stranded. And then also last year, the African Union launched its digital transformation strategy for the decade, which does aim to bridge the digital divide gap, provide broadband access to all by the end of the decade, harmonize national digital policies, of which there are many, develop and capacitate people with e-skills, and also establish digital IDs. Indeed, very important. Like we were saying, it's not a case that Africa is entering the world of digital diplomacy. Africa is already in it and a part of it. We've collected this through the Twiplomacy website, which is a ranking of all global leaders on Twitter, and you can see that in the top 50 we have 6 African leaders. So the first one is Abdel Al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, with 4.6 million followers, followed by Muhammadu Buhari, president of Nigeria, 3.8 million, Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda, 37th spot, 2.2 million. Then there's also the presidency of Nigeria. So the president has his own account, and then the presidency also tweets. That's also a very popular one. And then we see presidents of Uganda and Ghana also in the top 50, which are certainly very respectable numbers. They obviously do not compare to the sort of following that Mr. Trump used to have before he was kicked off Twitter, but we also need to take the geopolitical realities and interest in superpower politics into account. So coming back to the webinars that Bob mentioned, Martha, I see you. How much time do I have left?
I'm going to give you 2 more minutes.
Okay.
You have the time, but I realize you want to.
I'll be wrapping up. So we had data from the 20 or so webinars that were held last year. We took verbatim notes of the questions that were posed, of the discussions that had, and then we were able to analyze them. And we also put them into a program called Wordle, which gave us a very interesting indication of what topics and what themes were the most prominent. So as you can see, information very much stands out. Terms digital, media, social, disinformation, diplomacy, misinformation were all very prominent from all these events. So the key themes were information, disinformation, and misinformation, also relating to some of the points that Dr. Matter made about digital propaganda. And obviously these days, you don't quite know what's true on the internet, and everything has to be fact checked, sometimes effectively, sometimes not. Platforms and messaging, what sorts of platforms are being used for what messaging. There is an increasing realization on behalf of African diplomats and diplomats elsewhere that Twitter might be more useful for one type of dissemination, Instagram for another, and Facebook for a third. Now TikTok is also entering this realm. Something very interesting that came up as an anecdote during the webinars, a diplomat noted that he started scanning notes verbal, which is a standard form of communication between diplomatic posts, and attaching those digitized documents to emails rather than sending them via courier because it took too long, and then email is obviously instantaneous. And then wrapping up with the themes, we also had Africa, COVID-19, how the continent is going to progress, privacy, especially in the context of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandals, and then also the role of Africa and the conflict between great powers, US and China. So I think this concludes the presentation, but let me hand over to Bob, and then he will go through the concluding slide.
Thank you, Yarik. I think we've, since Martha is going to be kind enough to give us a half a minute, I will try to summarize, to wrap it up in just a couple of words. One, I think a quick observation that Buhari, the president of Nigeria, has since left Twitter of his own volition, which is a demonstration, in fact, of digital diplomacy going awry. I think that the basic point that all these notes in the conclusion say is that while there is the practice of digital diplomacy on the African continent by MFAs and by officers of the presidency, most of this digital diplomacy has happened without strategic approaches. So we do not really have digital diplomacy policies, even though we have, in some instances, public diplomacy or diaspora diplomacy policies. And in fact, in some countries, we do not even have documented foreign policies, which seems to suggest that digital diplomacy on the African continent, hypothetically, and I think this we can revisit, has happened unintentionally, inadvertently, rather than with great focus. And I think the concluding word here is that the intentional approach compared to places like Israel, the US, China, and so forth, robs the country of the reputational capital that can be gained from a more focused and strategic and documented and strategized digital diplomacy. And I don't think that the continent wants to lose reputational capital that will derive from more organized approaches, because this reputational deficit will actually impact on Africa's soft power, Africa's economic wherewithal, and prosperity and related matters. And I think we'll stop there with our presentation. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Bob and Yurik. And that was a perfect segue for Odilile's paper, looking at continental diplomacy. I realized I didn't read the title of your paper. Do you want to upload your screen while
Yes.
Okay, so the title of the paper that Odilile contributed was The Digital Transformation of Diplomacy, Implications for the African Union and Continental Diplomacy. So over to you, Odilile.
Thank you very much, Martha. And thank you to my colleagues. As I'm sure you can hear, there's a theme that's running through between Ilan, Bob, and Yarik's paper, that digital diplomacy, or the digitalization of diplomacy, if you have it, is both operational as well as being relational. And I think that's a very important point that diplomats and scholars have to pay attention to in their research and in their policies. Now, I approached the topic of digitalization of diplomacy, or digital diplomacy, somewhat differently, in that I asked what the implications of digital diplomacy are for the African Union. I also asked, can Africa use digital transformation as a rallying point for continental diplomacy? Under the auspices of the African Union, Africa has long grappled with the idea of political and economic integration, as well as continental diplomacy. Over the last 20 years, we have seen the AU work on these issues, albeit with a very mixed record, primarily from the perspective of continental security, democratization, and cooperation. The AU Commission's Continental Development Plan, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, in a way reinvigorated continental leadership and vision, marrying both physical security to economic development. In the same vein, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which became operational this year, promises to deepen economic trade and integration. Now, these shifts have great import for the digital transformation and diplomacy of the African continent. In my paper, I argue that the African Union is and should be the apex institution driving digital transformation on the African continent. And digital transformation in itself is a key building block to the evolution of diplomacy. The promise of digital technologies is that it would optimize operations by improving efficiency and opening up communication channels. The ability to serve citizens quickly and efficiently is a concern of all parts of the public administration apparatus in every single country. My paper uses Nagihana's conceptualization of digital transformation, or rather what he also calls the digital transformation ecosystem, which calls for a holistic transformation to tap into the promise of ICTs and other digital technologies as what he calls a transformational enabler. Now, this aligns very closely to Brian Hawkins and Jan Mellison's whole of government approach to diplomacy. Now, for those who are not familiar with the whole of government approach, it is an approach to public administration that champions various parts of government operating together under a shared vision. So basically, all parties are singing from the same hymn book. From this perspective, public administration, public diplomacy, digital diplomacy, and peer-to-peer diplomatic engagement are all ensconced within the digital transformation efforts. As Yarik had mentioned, or Bob and Yarik in their presentation, in May 2020, the African Union launched its digital transformation strategy for Africa. Now, this is very important because according to the OECD, 40% of the world does not have access to the internet, which is the cornerstone of digitalization. And most of that 40% actually resides in Africa, which makes it even more important that African governments work collectively to stimulate digital transformation. Now, the AU digital transformation strategy is meant to help African countries tap into the digital economy, and it builds on previous instruments, such as the Policy and Regulatory Initiative for Africa, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa, the African Continental Free Trade Area, which I mentioned earlier, the Single Air Transport Market, the Protocol for the Free Movement of Persons. All of this is, the whole idea is to build a single digital market, which there's even strategies and frameworks regarding that. Nevertheless, the challenge and the concern for the AU's digital transformation strategy is that it runs the risk of suffering the same fate as the AU's 2014 Malabo Convention. Now, the Malabo Convention was the most wide-ranging cybersecurity and digital identity framework in existence at the time of its development. Now, by 2021, most AU member states have not adopted or ratified the convention. And the big reason for that is that many countries just didn't understand the value of having such a framework in place. And another thing we can't ignore is the political contestations between AU member states. However, what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us is that African governments can indeed work together. Now, we see that in the development and operationalization of the African Medical Supplies Platform. The platform is a supply chain solution developed by the AU to facilitate the purchasing of medicines and medical equipment such as personal protective gear to fight the COVID-19 pandemic on the continent. It has an online platform to ease pool procurement and distribution. And the project was made possible because of smart partnerships between the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and Africa's Export-Import Bank. Now, continental diplomacy is an exercise in multilateralism. The digital age and the pandemic has forced Africa to, and the AU specifically, to reconsider what it puts its energy behind. In other words, digital transformation has shifted its diplomatic priorities. Consequently, security and democratization are no longer the lifeblood of the continent's diplomacy, even though it's still important. Now, my article aims to reinvigorate theoretical discourse on what continental diplomacy in Africa entails, particularly under the rubric of digital transformation. My notion of continental diplomacy is rooted in Ali Mazroui's conceptualization of Pax Africana. Pax Africana is predicated on the idea that Africans are responsible for their economic development and political stability. Essentially, peace is a function of economic security and is not just an absence of violent conflict. Since the OAU's evolution to the AU, it has gone through several processes to, at least on paper, bring the union more in line with the Pax Africana aspiration. Now, I propose a preliminary definition of continental diplomacy, and what I'm proposing is the marshaling of diplomatic resources for the continent's economic development and political stability. And this will be achieved by securing regional interests as identified in continental development plans. Previously, or part of our African Union's problem is not clearly identifying what its interests are. Its interests are often shaped by other parties. I'm going to finish up or conclude with this. Ultimately, without the much needed investment into critical infrastructure, particularly into ICTs and other digital infrastructures, all diplomatic efforts to exploit the benefits of digital transformation will come to naught. The dream of Pax Africana will remain stillborn if we don't work on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Odilile, for that excellent overview and those very clear slides. Thank you. I would like to open the floor. We've had a few questions in the chat box and in the Q&A. I think there's only one that has not already been answered. So perhaps I'll start by reading that one. And it's from Kendrick Chan, who asks, thank you for the presentations. Just a quick question. Apart from platforms like social media, to what extent do you consider traditional websites, e.g. community forums, portals, etc., to be a key consideration in digital PR or outreach for MFAs? And I think, in fact, that could be answered by any of our panelists. So I wonder if I'll just start with Ilan, if you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, well, thank you for this interesting question. It's true that a lot of contemporary digital diplomacy, I mean, there were years in which the focus was on social media. Now we see a larger focus on technologies such as big data analysis, network analysis, sentiment analysis, and artificial intelligence. I think that the role of traditional websites and web forums is especially important when we consider the audiences of digital diplomacy. So a lot of times, foreign ministries or embassies will try to create a new invention, saying, let's create a new web portal where diasporas can come together and interact, but these portals actually already exist because the diaspora has created them. And this can take the form of Facebook groups, but also of traditional websites and web forums. And these are avenues through which diplomats can interact with foreign populations and with diasporas. An important issue, though, that has been identified in previous studies is transparency. So some of the diaspora forums are willing to engage with diplomats, but they want diplomats to announce their presence. And sometimes diplomats begin to partake in online conversations without revealing the fact that they are diplomats, and that actually causes reputational damage. But I think especially if we look at the global south, we find that host countries are often host to very, very well-developed web forums in which diasporas and foreign populations come together to discuss issues of mutual concern. So they are definitely a part of digital diplomacy.
Thank you. Would any of the other panelists like to address that question?
Sure, I can chime in by just saying that indeed there's been a rise of social media, so much so that sometimes there's talk of social media diplomacy as a subset of digital diplomacy. But I think in the recent past, as the field has developed both from the practice and the conceptual end of things, there's been a realization that ministries of foreign affairs, presidencies, and other diplomatic actors, in fact, need websites and web portals. And so there's been a return to web development if you just look around. And but it's not just really the web presence in terms of a URL and having a web presence, but to what extent is information on the website current? To what extent does the public-facing elements of the website attractive? And to what extent is it updated regularly? And so in one of my escapades online, I go looking at African websites, and you'll find some have not been updated for a couple of years. Some are permanently under construction. Some have do not have very good images and so forth. Obviously, the DIRCO one is one of the better one, but I invite you to, at your own free time, just go looking at the websites of African ministries, foreign affairs, and you can do your own rating, or indeed even look at the embassies, and you can see why, in fact, a very intentional approach of developing policies and following up with upskilling and retooling will be important. I think finally on this point is the fact that one of the functions, as one of our colleagues, senior colleagues in the field, Nicholas Carl, is called Nick Carl from University of Southern California, has pointed out one of the roles of digital diplomacy and these digital platforms is an opportunity for us to listen, because one of the functions of diplomacy is actually listening. And if people are listening to you, what are they listening to? And that just taps into the importance of an agile, dynamic, presence. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That's a very important insights. We have two more questions. I'd like to address the next question to Odilile because it looks at Africa. How can digital diplomacy be employed for peace processes in Africa, especially in regions and countries facing various forms of conflict?
Thank you very much, Martha. I think, in fact, we do have an article by Dr. Floribert Ndong, which in a way touches on this, in that he points out the dangers, pros and cons of digital diplomacy, in that it could be used by non-state actors or so-called problematic actors in order to, further their causes. But at the same time, it could be used by African governments to do the same, and the reverse for both parties is true. I believe that it can be used for peace processes in that, like Dr. Ndong argues, to have a set message, especially in times of conflict. The messaging and the framing is very important to essentially cool down tempers. And yeah, that's how I'd answer that. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. The next question we have, unless anyone else would like to take up that particular question on peace processes and conflict in Africa, we have a question addressed to Ilan Manor. Did the MFAs of Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia get the final results of your research? If yet, what was their reaction?
Well, that's a very good question. Always important to maintain a link between academic research and the policymakers in the field. There is always a bit of a problem with this, because many academic articles tend to be critical of the nations that they evaluate, and even a positive article can include some negative criticism, so it's not always positively reviewed. But we have relayed our findings to the Kenyan Foreign Ministry and to the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry, and both of them have been eager to try and replicate the successes of the embassies that we have looked at. So for instance, if the Ethiopian embassy in Israel was found to be especially active and interactive in diaspora outreach, the Foreign Ministry is now looking to learn from that model and replicate it to other embassies. I think also, as Bob and Jarek spoke, forums, seminars, webinars are very, very good ways of narrowing the knowledge gaps between academics working in digital diplomacy and those practitioners who actually practice digital diplomacy. And it's a two-way street, because many times when we hold webinars with diplomats, we learn about new initiatives that we had no idea about, ranging from WhatsApp groups at the UN in Geneva to using TikTok in private and official life. So thank you for the question.
Excellent. We have two questions from Zavinka Katur, and I think I'll read them both, and perhaps Jarek and Bob would like to answer these. The first is referring to the fact that social media platforms are legally registered in the US. And this question asks, have you explored any examples of the restrictions on the possibilities of communication among African leaders or of their ideas? More to the point. Secondly, looking at the majority of ICT infrastructure, the questioner claims that it is not manufactured in African countries. Do you think the choice of the technology has an impact on the African countries' digital diplomacy? So basically looking at extraneous control over digitization or digitalization, that term. Jarek?
I think the first question actually provides a interesting new theme for possible research on this topic. In terms of looking at these companies being registered in the US and sort of ramifications that it has. I mean, we know that, for instance, in China, Apple agrees to store all the data of its users on local Chinese servers where they could be accessed by the Chinese government, in the case of the national emergency. I'm certainly not aware of such examples in Africa, although, like Bob questioned, like Bob mentioned, we did have the example of the Nigerian government trying to ban Twitter. So at the moment, indeed, many Nigerian users are using VPNs, and from what I've read, government officials, media organizations are not allowed to use it for purposes of disseminating information and posting links to their articles. I remember in South Africa, the EFF also wanted 5 or 6 years ago to shut down Twitter, although their leader is now very active. on the platform. But yeah, certainly, thank you for the question. I think that is a very interesting one that we can investigate going forward. Indeed, on the types of technologies where they are manufactured, this is something that I've looked at a few years ago in terms of ICT infrastructure. Certainly Huawei, Chinese companies are much more interested and willing to invest in Africa than many of the European ones, Nokia, Siemens, certainly not much interest from American companies. And all this has further implications for different models of digital sovereignty, whereas the open one that the US and the European Union are advocating for, or a very closed one that China and Russia are looking at. So the choice of the service provider certainly does have implications for geopolitics at large.
I think I can, with Martha's permission, with moderator's permission,
Yes,
also just point out a couple of points that are interesting. Obviously, this question points to the fact that we are just scratching the surface in terms of digital diplomacy, not just in African digital diplomacy, but globally. It's a new phenomenon. I think one of the broad areas, in fact, digital diplomacy is seen in a broader sense to be part of the digital humanities, which is really the intersection of technologies and all these humanities that we know of. But an interesting development that is really political, what we can call digital politics, as it were, in a broader sense, which ties into digital diplomacy, is the notion of internet sovereignty or sovereignty. And the big argument here, in fact, has been the competition between China, particularly, and the US, in which discussion, China has argued that every country has a right to decide the approaches it uses for its internet. So in the Chinese case, internet and related technologies are very highly controlled. Social media such as Facebook and so forth are actually blocked, banned. Use of VPNs is standard practice in mainland China and Hong Kong and places like that. Whereas on the other end, the US and the West more broadly promotes what they call internet democracy and openness and things like those. So I think it's a debate that has featured on the African continent, particularly from last year when there was a trade war between China and the US, particularly targeting Huawei and the whole 5G issue. And I think Ilan maybe might provide the Israeli interest in this matter better than I can put them. But essentially, it has been that African countries need to follow one path or another. And I think it's an interesting discussion in all. And I think the Chinese have gone to create their own Baidu, for example, which is their Facebook, or Weixin, which is WeChat, which is WhatsApp, and so forth and so on, by pointing to what the questioner was actually alluding to, that many of the URLs, which is really the assigning of the names that then become the platforms, are assigned by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, which is an American entity with links to the Department of Commerce in the US. And the critique has been that therefore all our information, most of our information is on the servers in the US. Now, in the age of surveillance and infiltration and so forth, obviously countries will be worried of their information be sitting on the servers somewhere where they can be tampered with, particularly with the infiltration and so forth. On the African continent, to give quick examples, there have been internet blockages in Tanzania early this year during the election, in Uganda last year during the elections, and in DRC, I think in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, during the elections again. And here what has been said is that the accusation has been leveled at the Chinese. I don't know how true this is. This is also warfare, that they have been involved, in fact, in those blockages. But it's an interesting question that we need perhaps to do some further research on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. I wonder if I could just also direct the attention of those interested in this question to Leslie Masters' paper. She is one of the authors in this special issue that looks at Africa, the Fourth Industrial Revolution and digital diplomacy, renegotiating the international knowledge structure. And that's maybe taking a step back from the technology to looking at the way the whole question about digital sovereignty is going to be negotiated, and what voice does Africa have in that forum. So I would encourage people to take a look at that paper. Odilile, did you also have something to add there?
Yeah, just a very quick point to throw the cat amongst the pigeons, so to speak. As much as we're discussing or touching on digital sovereignty or the idea of data autonomy, especially for the African continent, one thing that we need to understand, grapple with, look at, is there's recent research by CDD West Africa. I can't remember who they partnered with, where they found that a lot of many of the recent troll farms that are involved in election interference are actually based in Nigeria. So for Nigeria, the implications of that is massive. So basically the Twitter ban is a lot more than just somebody being the government being authoritarian and deciding to shut it off. There's several layers. It's a very nuanced discussion. So yeah, that's something that we can all look at and also think about that. When we're seeing a shutdown, is it just a shutdown or what else is happening? And that's my contribution.
Yeah, very good question, and also a subject for future research, no doubt, in this area. There is a question, and I see, Ilan, that you've been answering some of the questions in the chat box. Thank you. I would encourage those who haven't looked at those questions and answers to take a look there in a moment. But there is a very good, interesting question here. How do scholars encourage the study of digitalization of diplomacy in our academic institutions in Africa? And I don't know, having read all these papers, I know there was mentioned several times of the need to encourage more research into this in Africa. Does anyone have any ideas on how that could be encouraged?
Maybe I can start off with a quick point, and then let my colleagues also chime in. I think one is that much of the research you've seen in digital diplomacy in African universities has come mostly at postgraduate level, master's and PhD, usually thesis. And some of those end up being journal articles and so forth. But what has happened elsewhere? I think Ilan is here. He can give us the example of Oxford University Digital Research Group, which is a dedicated research center. There's a center on public diplomacy that has gone into that area. So I think what we lack on the continent, first of all, is that we do not have curriculum on digital diplomacy. Course materials that are Africa specific, even though we can also look at the universality of the question. So much so that students who are interested, and a few lecturers who are interested, kind of go into that as research projects, as theses, in fact. But I think the teaching of it has to catch up, and I suppose it has to be advocated for. In many universities, including UCT, where Martha is based, including WITS, where we are based, including UJ, University of Johannesburg, where Odilile is, bringing a course on board takes a while. And often there's some very serious resistance by particularly scholars who are conventional, who say, no, look, there can be nothing like digital diplomacy course. So I suppose it will call for advocacy campaigns and so forth to say it's important for us to really start having courses that are dedicated specifically to this. Thank you.
Okay. Can I just add a few lines? Thank you. Bob's very right. There's a pushback by scholars who are married to very traditional, conventional ideas of diplomacy, ideas of what international relations look like. However, UJ is very different in that UJ is what we're calling the 4IR University. That's what's driving us. And in the Department of Politics and International Relations, a lot of the a lot of research, a lot of the courses are now having not just a 4IR strain and a technology strain. So it's something that, where we might not have a set curriculum. However, the curriculum that is being used and worked with, the lecturers and people who are involved are constantly seeing what's available and actually shifting. So it's very dynamic. And I think for many African countries, that's what's necessary, is for people to allow today is not working, but just allowing flexibility in terms of how they teach and what they teach, because it's very pointless to stick to looking at Huntington and not anything else, or looking at Waltz and nothing else, and and that's what I have to share. Thanks.
Fantastic. Ilan, I don't know if you want to speak to that point that Bob invited you to speak to.
Yeah, just two or three comments. First, what we have discovered, we established a research group at Oxford University about 4 years ago, dedicated specifically to the research of digital diplomacy. Now, obviously, Oxford has its appeal and has its brand name, but what we have found looking across the world, working with the foreign ministries of Kosovo and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and Romania and really all over the world, is that diplomats are very eager to learn more about digital diplomacy and to excel their digital practices. So one way would be to have initiatives with different foreign ministries on the continent, where foreign ministries basically endow academic research, which then feeds back into the policy formulation process and enables foreign ministries to better obtain their goals using digital diplomacy. And this is something that we do all the time. We will get a grant from the German Foreign Ministry asking, how should we reshape our digital department? And we will do a study. We'll publish the study, but we will also go back to the German Foreign Ministry and help them redesign their communications department. The second thing, I have been contacted because of this event by several journals outside of Africa asking if I knew anyone who would edit a special issue on diplomacy or digital diplomacy in Africa. So several of the leading journals in IR and diplomacy studies are actually looking for special issues on Africa in digital, but not solely digital. And I think that that's a wonderful opportunity. And third, blog sites. A lot of diplomats and a lot of the academic conversations about digital diplomacy happen on blog sites because some journals still don't know how to approach the topic of digital diplomacy. It's still not fully legitimate or kosher, as we would say in Israel. But blog sites are a very, very effective way of getting an agenda going and creating conversations among scholars about a specific topic or region. So that might also work.
Excellent. I see we have some questions that we haven't necessarily got time for. I'm just going to take one from Johansi van Veek. She's asked a few, but I wanted to just pose this, and this will be the final opportunity also to make any comments from the different panelists. She is very interested in this, the way that African states and leaders have hired international PR companies to promote their images in the past. And she's wondering what the impact of that is and whether there are any signs of propaganda from one African state directed at another African state, and whether that's been carried out by these PR companies or otherwise. So I wonder if any of you have done any research on that question. This is obviously entering into Yurik's whole slide on disinformation, misinformation, and information, which was a very interesting sort of analysis in that paper.
No, I think that I can jump in quickly with a couple of points, then let my colleagues speak. It appears, and as we said, I think, again, just going back to Ilan's very seminal definition of the digitalization of diplomacy, going with all manner of diplomatic engagements. So where there's conflict between nations, African nations included, almost digital diplomacy targeting each other follows quite immediately. And I will invite colleagues to look at the case of Rwanda and Uganda, which have had, had very close relations in the past. In fact, the current Rwandese regime is supposed to have come out of the national resistance movement of Yoweri Museveni. but they kind of fell out very dramatically. And if you look at communication by the official, social networking sites and individual diplomats and so forth, it has taken the form of combat, and it has involved, in fact, misinformation and disinformation. And I know this. I haven't done quite some heavy research on that, but I know this because I'm an East African myself. So I am in some East African groups, and you actually see some of those memes and misinformation coming through, and kind of networked. You see it on Twitter, and it's communicated via WhatsApp group. You find it on Facebook at some point, and in some form or another. And I think another interesting example would be the fallout over the Nile Dam between Ethiopia and Egypt. The great is it Renaissance Dam, which has pitted Egypt vis-a-vis Ethiopia, in the midst of Ethiopia's own internal turmoil in the Tigray area, bringing in fact, Eritrea and Sudan. And I know for a fact that there's been use of comparative kind of messaging on digital platforms in those respects. But it's an interesting question worth pursuing. Thank you.
Very interesting. Would anyone else like to comment? One last comment before I close.
I'll just throw in another cat amongst the pigeons. What I have, or something I'm looking at right now is not necessarily disinformation online originating from states, but disinformation originating from NGOs. And case in point, very recently, and is applicable to South Africa, is that prior to the US requesting South Africa to take in Afghan refugees, there was a steady uptick of negative comments. And if you look at a lot of those things, a lot of the comments, especially on Twitter, they were bots. They weren't real people against South Africa. And when South Africa said, no, they're not able to take in these refugees because of their own issues, the negativity increased, and after a while it died down. But if you start kind of unraveling it, it doesn't necessarily look like it came from the US government, but it looks like it came from NGOs. And and there's a lot to be considered and to be looked at about the NGOs, specifically Christian fundamentalist NGOs that are operating on the African continent, including in South Africa, and their influence, and and the fact that they are using social media to win hearts and minds, so to speak. Thank you.
Interesting case. Thank you very much. I don't know, Eric and Ilan, if you have any closing comments before I end this session.
I would just end with a more general comment, because some of the things that have come up in this panel, I know that there's a tendency to look at countries such as America and Sweden and Denmark and Norway and the UK as countries that have a very clear digital strategy. They know where they're coming, they know what they want to achieve. But the reality is that half of the time they too are dazed and confused, because they're constantly bombarded with new technologies, new challenges. And if you actually look at the cycle of digitalization, it's crisis, adoption of new technologies, trial and error, learning, and developing guidebooks. So we seem to, there's sometimes this idea of the West and the rest, where the West is very organized and the rest of the world is in mayhem. But I think that a lot of the challenges that are currently facing African foreign ministries and African diplomats are the same challenges that these countries addressed maybe 3-4 years ago. So there's a time lag, but it's definitely a similar experience. That was my final note.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Eric? Or Bob?
Not much from my side.
Okay.
Just to thank my fellow panelists for today. Thank you, Martha, for moderating, and thank you to all the participants. I think we've had a very good audience today and some very interesting questions. So please, I've seen that Maxine was posting links to articles. If you're interested, do go on the website and read through them. And then also please feel free to contact us if you want to keep the discussion going on further.
Thank you. I would like to just also announce that we've got 2 of the papers, those by the guest editors, free to view through October, as well as the introductory article. So I will encourage anyone who just wants to dip their toe in, perhaps they'll want to buy the whole issue or access it through their library or through the very many opportunities on the Taylor and Francis website for scholars from the Global South to give vouchers for free articles. So I'm happy to help with that if there's any confusion looking at their website. I thank each one of the panelists. I thank also those authors who are not represented today for their excellent work and for developing this whole additional sort of contribution to the discussion on digital diplomacy in Africa and for Africa and by Africans, and I hope to see more. So I hope there might be more future special issues following on for some of the future research that we discussed today. And I'll close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All the best.
Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the wonderful questions.
Thank you.